$200. That's 2 tanks of gas. A dinner out with drinks for 2. A pair of shoes you'll wear a handful of times, then forget about. It doesn't feel like money that changes your life. It feels like money that disappears. But what if it doesn't have to? What if $200 a month, not once, not as a lump sum, but just $200 every single month for 30 years, is the difference between arriving at retirement with nothing and arriving with over $400,000? Not a typo. Not a trick. Not a special investment strategy or a lucky stock pick. Just $200. Every month. For 30 years. Here's what almost nobody tells you about money. The problem isn't that people don't earn enough to build wealth. The problem is that the way wealth actually builds is almost impossible to see in the short term. You can't feel it working. You can't watch it growing in real time. And because you can't see it, most people assume it isn't happening. So they stop. They redirect that $200 somewhere else. And 30 years later, they wonder why the math never worked out. You've probably heard the phrase compound interest before. Maybe in a high school class. Maybe in a YouTube video. Maybe from a parent who said it matter-of-factly, as if the phrase alone would be enough to change your habits. And if you're honest, it probably didn't. Because compound interest described in words sounds like a math problem. It doesn't sound like your life. So let's make it your life. Compound interest is the idea that your returns earn their own returns. The money your money makes also makes money. And those earnings earn earnings. And on, until the growth becomes so steep that the numbers stop looking real. You've probably seen that J-shaped exponential curve, flat for years, then bending sharply upward. That's not a diagram. That's what happens to your $200 a month if you leave it alone long enough. Here is what happens to $200 a month, invested consistently, assuming the historical average annual return of the S&P 500, which has delivered roughly 10% annually over the last century, or about 7% after adjusting for inflation. After 10 years, your $200 a month has become approximately $41,000. You've put in $24,000 of your own money. The market added $17,000 on top of that. That's real, but it doesn't feel magical yet. You might think, I could have bought a used car with that. Or paid down some debt. You'd be right. But you'd also be missing what's about to happen. After 20 years, the number is $153,000. You've contributed $48,000. The market added over $100,000. Now the math starts to feel different. More than 2/3 of what you have is money you never earned and never saved. It appeared because time passed and the returns compounded on themselves, again and again, quietly, while you weren't watching. After 30 years, the total is $452,000. You contributed $72,000 of your own money. The market, through compound growth, generated over $380,000. More than 80% of your final balance is pure compounding, money that materialized not from your income, not from your savings rate, but from time itself. $200 a month. 30 years. $452,000. That is not a sales pitch. That is the S&P 500's documented historical performance, studied and confirmed by Vanguard's long-term return analysis and supported by decades of academic research on index fund investing. Now here's the counterintuitive part. The most important decade in that entire 30-year journey is the last one. Not the first. Not the middle. The last. In years 1 through 10, you built $41,000. In years 21 through 30, on the exact same $200 a month, you built over $270,000. The final decade produced more wealth than the first 20 years combined. Not because you did anything differently. Not because the market performed better in those years. But because the base had grown large enough that the compound returns were now enormous. A 10% return on $41,000 is $4,100. A 10% return on $300,000 is $30,000. Same percentage. Completely different dollar amount. This is what the financial industry almost never explains clearly. You are not paid proportionally for the years you invest. You are paid exponentially. The early years feel like nothing. The late years feel like magic. But the late years only exist if you stay through the early years. Quit in year 15, and you never get the acceleration. You leave the runway before the plane lifts off. This brings us to the single most expensive habit in personal finance. The DALBAR QAIB Annual Report, which has tracked actual investor behavior against market returns since 1994, consistently finds the same sobering result. The average equity mutual fund investor earns significantly less than the market itself returns. In a recent 20-year analysis, the S&P 500 delivered roughly 9.1% annually. The average investor in those same funds? About 7.7%. That 1.4% gap doesn't sound devastating. But on a 30-year compound journey starting from $200 a month, that gap costs you more than $100,000. $100,000 lost not to bad investments, but to bad behavior. Why do investors underperform the very funds they invest in? They sell when the market drops. They buy when the market rises. They feel something, fear, excitement, anxiety, certainty, and they act on it. And every time they act on it, they reset the compound clock. They step off the escalator. And compound interest does not wait for you to get back on. There is a name for this in behavioral finance: recency bias. It is the tendency to treat recent events as permanent trends. The market drops 20%, and your brain, wired for survival, not for index funds, concludes the market is heading to zero. You sell. The market recovers. You've locked in a permanent loss and missed the rebound, all in the name of protecting yourself. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist and author of Thinking, Fast and Slow, demonstrated through decades of research that humans experience losses roughly twice as painfully as equivalent gains feel good. This is loss aversion, and it is the most expensive cognitive bias in personal finance. Losing $1,000 hurts about twice as much as gaining $1,000 feels good. Which means you are biologically motivated to avoid losses even when avoiding them makes you poorer in the long run. The market will get uncomfortable. That is guaranteed. The S&P 500 has dropped 10% or more in a single year more than 30 times since 1950. It has entered bear market territory, a drop of 20% or more, over a dozen times. And after every single one of those crashes, the index has recovered and gone on to set new all-time highs. Every single time. Which means the investor who stayed, who kept sending that $200 a month no matter how loud the news cycle became, is the investor who collected all the returns. And the investor who panicked and pulled out is the investor who realized the loss, missed the recovery, and will likely spend years trying to make back what the panic cost them. Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard in 1974 and created the index fund for ordinary investors, spent decades offering the same advice. Stay the course. Not a hot stock. Not a timing strategy. Not a sophisticated formula that only works if you get everything right. Stay the course. 3 words that have made more people wealthy than any financial innovation of the last 50 years. Now let's talk about what most people actually do with $200 a month. According to Federal Reserve survey data on household spending, the average American household spends more on entertainment and dining each month than they contribute to any long-term savings vehicle. The $200 that could be quietly compounding over 3 decades is instead going toward streaming subscriptions, delivery apps, impulse purchases, and purchases that provide an hour of satisfaction and exactly 0 long-term return. This is not a judgment. It is a description of how the system is designed. Every advertisement you encounter is optimized to redirect your money into immediate consumption. The spending is loud. The investing is quiet. And quiet things are easy to ignore, easy to postpone, easy to say you'll start next month. Except next month becomes next year, and next year becomes a decade. Here is the number that should cut through everything. If you are 25 years old and you start investing $200 a month today, you arrive at 55, still 10 years before traditional retirement, with over $450,000. If you wait until 35 to start, same $200 a month, same 30-year horizon, same destination. But waiting those 10 years doesn't just delay your wealth. It destroys roughly $200,000 of it. That is the cost of the decade you spent saying you'd start soon. You cannot go back and earn it. You cannot compensate for it by investing more later. The compound clock runs in one direction. Warren Buffett, worth well over $100 billion, made more than 95% of his fortune after the age of 60. Not because he suddenly discovered better investments. Not because he found a secret edge unavailable to anyone else. But because his decades of consistent, patient compounding finally reached the steep part of the exponential curve, the part that only exists after you've been consistent long enough for the base to become enormous. His real skill was not genius. His real skill was not selling when every rational voice offered reasons to. Staying invested across crashes, recessions, wars, and moments of genuine global uncertainty. That discipline is not reserved for billionaires. It is available to anyone with $200 a month and the patience to leave it alone. So what does this mean for you right now? If you have $200 a month that is currently flowing toward something that will not matter in 30 years, the math is simple. Choosing a low-cost broad market index fund through any major brokerage takes about 20 minutes. Setting up an automatic monthly contribution takes 5 more. The hardest part is what comes next, doing nothing. Not checking the balance every week. Not selling when the market drops 15% and everyone on social media is convinced it's over. Not touching it when you feel financially anxious and your brain starts looking for something to control. The market will test you. It always does. People you trust will say the economy is different this time. It never is. And when the market recovers, not if, when, the investors who stayed will have compounded their way to something their future selves will be genuinely grateful for. $200 a month. Not a fortune. Not a sacrifice. Not a number that requires a raise or a windfall or a lucky break. Just $200. Every month. For 30 years. You know what it is now. The question is what you do with it.